There was a moment when everything felt like it was slipping through your fingers, but not in the way people usually describe. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it didn't come with closure or clarity. It came in silence, in delayed replies, in the subtle pulling away that made you question your own reality. And deep down, even if you didn't want to admit it at the time, you could feel that something was being controlled, orchestrated, almost like there was a quiet plan unfolding behind the scenes that you weren't fully aware of. You tried to hold on, to understand, to adjust yourself just enough so things wouldn't break. But what you didn't realize then was that the distance you were experiencing wasn't confusion on their end, it was intention. They believed that by stepping back, by creating emotional space, by becoming just unavailable enough, they could shift the balance of power without ever having to explain themselves. And for a while, it worked. You felt it. The uncertainty, the overthinking, the emotional weight of trying to figure out what changed, they expected that. In fact, they counted on it. Because in their mind, control doesn't come from closeness, it comes from distance. From being the one who feels less, who needs less, who can walk away without hesitation. That's the role they thought they had mastered. But what they didn't account for was what happens when the person on the other side stops playing their part. In the beginning, everything they did felt subtle, almost invisible, unless you were paying close attention. The shift didn't happen overnight. It came in small fragments. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly started feeling shorter, more surface level. Moments that once felt warm and connected started carrying this strange emotional coldness. And if you brought it up, if you tried to understand it, it was often brushed off or minimized, leaving you feeling like maybe you were the one overthinking. Maybe you were expecting too much. But that was part of the design, because the less clarity you had, the more you would search for it, the more you would lean in, and the more you leaned in, the more they could lean back without ever fully losing you. It created this imbalance where you were giving more, thinking more, feeling more, while they remained just out of reach. And in their mind, that distance wasn't a problem, it was the solution. It gave them space to avoid vulnerability, to stay emotionally safe, and most importantly, to maintain control without ever having to say it out loud. They convinced themselves that this was the only way to protect their independence, to keep things from becoming too intense, too real. Because real connection requires exposure, it requires emotional risk. And that's exactly what they were trying to avoid. What they didn't realize is that their version of control was built on a fragile assumption that you would always respond the same way. That no matter how distant they became, no matter how much they pulled back, you would still be there trying to close the gap, trying to fix what was never clearly broken. They believed your emotional consistency was something they could rely on, something predictable. And because of that, they felt safe continuing the same pattern. Pull away, wait, observe, and let you come closer again. It became almost like a silent strategy, one they didn't even need to consciously think about anymore. It was automatic, conditioned. Every time things felt too close, too intense, they would create space. And every time they created space, you would feel it, respond to it, and try to restore the connection. That cycle gave them reassurance. It told them that no matter how far they stepped back, they wouldn't actually lose you. And that belief is what allowed them to keep going, to keep choosing distance over communication, silence over clarity, control over connection. But what happens when that pattern suddenly stops working is something they were never prepared for. Because at some point, something inside you started to shift. Not all at once, not in a dramatic moment, but slowly, quietly, in a way that even you might not have fully noticed at first. The same distance that once made you anxious started to make you reflective. The same silence that once made you chase started to make you pause. You began to realize that no matter how much effort you put in, no matter how much you tried to understand, the outcome stayed the same. And that realization, it changes something deep inside a person. It moves you out of reaction and into awareness. You start to see the pattern instead of just feeling the pain. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The urge to chase begins to fade, not because you stopped caring, but because you started respecting yourself more than the confusion. You started choosing your own peace over their unpredictability, and that's the exact moment everything they thought they had under control began to slip. Because your role in the dynamic was never passive, it was essential. And once you stopped feeding into the pattern, the entire structure started to collapse. At first, they didn't understand what was happening. The shift in your energy was subtle, but it was real. You weren't reacting the same way anymore. You weren't over-explaining, overreaching, or trying to force connection where it wasn't being given. Your presence became lighter, less attached, less available in a way they couldn't quite explain. And that's when the confusion started to set in on their side. Because this wasn't part of the plan. You were supposed to chase. You were supposed to feel the distance and try to close it. But instead, you created your own space. And for the first time, they were the ones left in uncertainty, the ones questioning, the ones trying to figure out what changed. And that shift, it doesn't just surprise them, it unsettles them, because control only works when both people stay in their assigned roles. And the moment you stepped out of yours, everything they relied on stopped making sense. What they thought was a winning strategy began to backfire in ways they never expected. And that's when something even deeper begins to unfold, something they can't immediately label or understand, but they can feel it, and it doesn't feel good. Because the version of you they had grown used to, the one who would lean in, who would try to fix the silence, who would fill in the emotional gaps they created, that version is no longer showing up the same way. And it's not that you've disappeared, it's not that you've become cold or unrecognizable, it's that your energy has shifted into something calmer, something more grounded, something that no longer revolves around their unpredictability. You're still there, but you're not reaching in the same way. You're not chasing clarity that isn't being offered. You're not trying to decode every small change in their behavior. And that subtle difference, it changes everything. Because now, instead of feeling like they have space to retreat into, it starts to feel like they're the ones being left behind in a silence they created. And for the first time, that silence doesn't feel like control. It feels like distance they can't close. You start focusing on yourself in ways that don't involve them at all. Your thoughts aren't constantly circling around what they're doing, what they're thinking, or why they haven't reached out. Your energy begins to return to you. You invest in your own growth, your own peace, your own direction. And while the shift is healthy, natural, and necessary for you, to them, it feels unfamiliar because they were never expecting you to step out of the emotional loop they had grown comfortable with. They thought your attention would always be available, always within reach, always something they could reconnect with when it suited them. But now that access feels uncertain, and uncertainty is something they've always tried to avoid. So when they start to feel it directed at them, it hits differently. It creates a quiet tension they can't easily escape. Because unlike you, they're not used to sitting with unanswered questions. They're used to being the ones who create them. At first, the confusion shows up in small ways. They might check your activity more often. They might reread past conversations, looking for signs they missed. They might even convince themselves that nothing has really changed, that you're just busy, distracted, or going through something temporary. But deep down, there's a growing awareness that something is different. Your responses feel lighter, less emotionally charged. Your absence feels more real, more intentional. And the more they try to make sense of it, the more they realize they can't control it the way they used to. And that's where the frustration begins. Because control for them was never about domination, it was about predictability. It was about knowing how things would unfold based on their actions. But now, that predictability is gone. Their usual patterns don't create the same reactions. Their distance doesn't pull you closer. Their silence doesn't make you speak louder. And without that feedback loop, they're left in a space they don't know how to navigate. That frustration slowly turns inward, not in a way they openly express, but in a way that builds beneath the surface. They start questioning things they never questioned before, not necessarily out loud, not in a way that invites conversation, but internally, quietly. They begin to wonder why the same actions that once gave them a sense of control are now creating distance they didn't intend. And that realization, it's uncomfortable because it forces them to confront something they've been avoiding for a long time, that their way of handling connection might not be as effective as they believed, that maybe, just maybe, the distance they used to protect themselves is now the very thing pushing people away in a way that isn't reversible. And that thought doesn't sit easily. It creates tension between what they're used to doing and what they're starting to feel. And then comes the moment that shifts everything even further. The realization that you're not just pulling back emotionally, you're evolving. And this isn't something they can easily dismiss. It's visible even in subtle ways. The way you carry yourself feels different. The way you communicate feels more centered, more intentional. There's a quiet confidence in your energy that wasn't there before, or maybe it was always there, just buried under the weight of trying to hold everything together. And now that it's surfacing, it creates a contrast they can't ignore, because the version of you they were used to was someone who adapted to their distance. But this version adapts to itself. It doesn't shrink to maintain connection. It doesn't stretch to keep something from breaking. It simply exists in a way that feels whole, with or without their presence. And that is where the real shock begins, because everything they thought they understood about you starts to feel incomplete. The image they had built, the one where you would always be emotionally available, always willing to meet them halfway no matter how far they stepped back, that image no longer fits. And when that image breaks, it creates a kind of internal instability they're not prepared for. Because now they don't just feel like they've lost control of the situation, they feel like they've misunderstood you entirely. And that realization brings something else to the surface. Curiosity. Not the casual kind, but the kind that comes from not knowing where you stand anymore. The kind that makes them pay attention in ways they didn't before. They start noticing details they once overlooked. The way you respond, the things you choose not to respond to, the way you seem unaffected by the same patterns that used to pull you in. And the more they observe, the more they realize that whatever they had planned, whatever they thought would keep things in their favor, isn't working anymore. And that's when the emotional shift begins to reverse. Slowly, subtly, but undeniably. The distance they created no longer feels like safety. It starts to feel like separation. The silence they used to rely on no longer feels like control. It starts to feel like loss. And the space they once needed to feel secure now feels like something they don't know how to close. Because closing that space would require something they've been avoiding this entire time, vulnerability. It would require them to step out of the role they've been playing and into something real, something uncertain, something that doesn't come with guarantees. And that's not easy for them. In fact, it's one of the hardest things they can face because it goes against everything they've conditioned themselves to believe about connection, about independence, about emotional safety. But at the same time, doing nothing no longer feels comfortable either. And that internal conflict, that tension between staying the same and risking something different, is what begins to consume them. They may not show it directly. They may not come forward with clear words or open admissions, but the shift is happening. It shows up in the way they start to linger a little longer in conversations, even if they don't fully engage. It shows up in the way they hesitate before pulling away again, as if something is holding them there, even if they don't understand what it is. It shows up in the small, almost invisible attempts to reconnect, checking in without saying too much, testing the waters without fully stepping in. And while these actions might seem inconsistent or confusing from the outside, they're actually signs of something deeper happening internally, a realization that the dynamic they once relied on has changed, that the control they thought they had is slipping, and that the person they assumed would always be there in the same way isn't anymore. And that's the moment where everything they plotted truly begins to backfire. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, but in a slow, undeniable unraveling. Because the very behaviors they used to maintain distance are now creating a gap they can't easily close. The silence they once used as a shield is now isolating them. The control they once felt is now replaced with uncertainty, and the person they thought they understood is now someone they're trying to figure out all over again. And that realization doesn't just surprise them, it shakes them, because it forces them to confront something they've avoided for a long time. That connection isn't something you can control without consequence. That distance doesn't come without risk, and that sometimes the very strategies used to protect something are the same ones that cause it to slip away. When as this quiet unraveling continues, something else begins to take shape inside them. Something they didn't expect to feel at this level. Curiosity turns into focus, not the casual kind, not the passing kind, but a deeper, almost consuming awareness of you. They start paying attention in ways they never did before. Not because they suddenly decided to care more, but because they no longer understand where they stand. And when someone who is used to control no longer understands the situation, they don't detach further. They observe closely, carefully. They begin to notice the smallest shifts in your tone, the timing of your responses, the energy behind your words, even the silence where words used to be. And what unsettles them the most is that your behavior no longer follows the patterns they had mapped out in their mind. You're not reacting to them, you're responding to yourself. And that difference creates a gap in their understanding that they can't easily fill, because now, instead of predicting you, they're trying to read you. And the more they try, the more they realize they don't have the same access they once did. This heightened awareness doesn't bring them peace, it brings tension, because every detail they notice only reinforces the same truth. They're no longer the center of your emotional world. And that realization is difficult to process, especially for someone who became comfortable knowing they had a certain place in your life without having to fully show up for it. They start replaying moments in their mind, trying to pinpoint when the shift happened. Was it something they said? Something they didn't say? A moment they pulled away too far? A silence that lasted too long? And while they search for answers, another feeling starts to creep in. One they've been avoiding for a long time. Regret. Not always clear, not always fully acknowledged, but present. It shows up in the spaces between their thoughts, in the pauses between their actions. It's the quiet realization that maybe they miscalculated, that maybe the distance they created wasn't as harmless as they believed, that maybe in trying to protect themselves, they created a loss they didn't intend. And this is where everything starts to reverse in a way that feels almost surreal to them, because the same behaviors that once kept them feeling safe are now the very things making them feel disconnected. The same silence that once gave them control is now making them feel invisible. The same emotional distance that once felt like strength now feels like something they can't overcome. And as this reversal settles in, something shifts in their internal narrative. You're no longer the one seeking clarity, they are. You're no longer the one trying to understand, they are. And that role reversal doesn't just confuse them, it destabilizes them, because it forces them into a position they've always tried to avoid, a position where they have to feel everything they once kept at a distance, the uncertainty, the vulnerability, the possibility of loss. And when those feelings surface all at once, without the usual defenses to suppress them, it creates an emotional weight they're not used to carrying. They might not admit it openly, but they begin to feel the absence of you in a way that goes beyond surface level missing. It's not just about communication or presence, it's about the energy you brought into their life, the consistency, the understanding, the emotional depth that once surrounded them, even when they didn't fully engage with it. And now that it's no longer being offered in the same way, they start to recognize its value, not in a dramatic, immediate realization, but in small, accumulating moments. The silence feels longer, the distance feels heavier, the connection feels uncertain, and that uncertainty, it lingers. Because for the first time, they don't know if they can get back to what they had before. They don't know if the door they assumed would always be open is still open at all. And with that uncertainty comes the urge to reach out. But even this isn't simple for them, because reaching out requires breaking the very pattern they've relied on for so long. It requires stepping into vulnerability, into openness, into a space where they can't control the outcome. So instead of direct communication, their attempts often come in subtle forms. A message that seems casual but carries underlying intention. A sudden check-in that feels random but isn't. A reaction, a comment, a small gesture that's meant to test the waters without fully stepping in. They're trying to reconnect, but in a way that still feels safe to them. And from the outside, it might seem inconsistent or confusing, but from within, it's a significant shift, because it means they're no longer comfortable staying completely distant. It means something inside them is pulling them back toward you, even if they don't fully understand it yet. At the same time, another thought begins to take hold, one that creates a different kind of tension altogether. The possibility that someone else could take their place. And this isn't just about jealousy. It's about replacement. Because for so long, they believed their position in your life was secure, not because they fully invested in it, but because they assumed your emotional attachment would keep it intact. But now that assumption feels uncertain. They start wondering who you're talking to, who you're connecting with, who might be experiencing the version of you they no longer have access to, and that thought, it unsettles them in a way they can't easily ignore, because it introduces a reality they weren't prepared for, that while they were creating distance, someone else could have been creating closeness, that while they were protecting themselves from vulnerability, someone else might have been stepping into it without hesitation. And this is where their internal conflict deepens even further, because now it's not just about losing control, it's about losing you entirely. And that possibility forces them to confront everything they've been avoiding. The way they handled connection, the way they responded to closeness, the way they chose distance over communication, silence over honesty. And while they might not fully process it all at once, the awareness is there. It sits beneath the surface, influencing their thoughts, their actions, their attempts to reconnect. And the more they feel it, the harder it becomes to ignore, because it's no longer just a pattern, it's a consequence of choices they made when they believed they had more time, more control, more certainty than they actually did. So their actions begin to carry a different energy, still subtle, still cautious, but more intentional. There's a sense of urgency beneath the surface, even if it's not fully expressed. They might try to reestablish connection in small ways, hoping to rebuild what feels like it's slipping. But at the same time, they're still navigating their own fears, their own resistance to vulnerability, their own internal contradictions. And that's what makes this stage so complex. Because they're caught between two opposing forces, the instinct to protect themselves by staying distant, and the growing realization that staying distant might cost them something they're not ready to lose. And in that tension, everything they once believed about control, about safety, about connection, begins to change. As their inner conflict peaks, a deeper fear takes over. They can feel you're not just pulling back, you're moving on, quietly, calmly, for real. You're no longer waiting where they left you, and that loss of control hits harder than anything before. The idea that someone else could step into your life shakes them, because it forces a truth they avoided. You were never guaranteed. This cracks their identity. The version of them that felt in control now feels lost. They're the ones overthinking, wondering, feeling the absence they once ignored. Emotions they suppressed rise all at once. Uncertainty, vulnerability, regret, and they don't know how to handle it. They're forced to face a hard question: who are they without control? Because the distance, silence, and detachment they relied on no longer protect them. They isolate them. And that realization is heavy because it means their own patterns created this outcome. Now they feel everything they once avoided. The connection has changed. You've changed. And they see it clearly. It wasn't sudden, it was the result of their choices. They tried to control the connection and slowly lost it. And for you, this is where your power shows. You didn't force anything. You just stopped chasing, chose your peace, and stepped out of the pattern. And the moment you did, everything they relied on fell apart. In the end, they're left with one truth: the very way they tried to keep control is exactly what made them lose you.